Welcome to our second season of Stratford Mail, a smart little history podcast from Stratford Hall Historic Preserve, where the voices of American history still speak. Find us online at stratfordmail.org and at stratfordhall.org. We're so glad you're back, and we hope you'll share Stratford Mail with a friend or colleague. Here now is our Director of Research, Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi.
Stratford Mail commemorates Women's History Month with a reply from a brother to his older sister on the topic of applying a revolutionary principle more widely. Hannah Lee, later Hannah Corbin, was born in February 1728 at Machotic Plantation, only a year before it was looted and burned to the ground by immigrant felons disgruntled about judgments entered against them by Hannah's father and Westmoreland County Justice Thomas Lee. Among the tragedies of that cold January night in 1729 was the loss of her father's library, which included the library of his father, Richard, nicknamed the Scholar, one of the most impressive libraries in the Virginia colony. Hannah shared her grandfather's passion for books, but the Scholar may have disapproved of a literary genre well represented in Hannah's library, specifically by what a Virginia Gazette writer condemned as
literary opium.
Novels. Yes, novels. The novel was an emerging alternative to traditional advice literature and often stood traditional advice on its head. Where traditional advice might counsel women to rely on the honor and superior intellect of men to guarantee female virtue, novels shifted that responsibility from unreliable men to capable women. Receipts indicate that Hannah was an avid consumer of novels, with titles like The Fortunate Country Maid, The History of a Young Lady of Distinction, and True Merit, True Happiness. Headstrong and capable Hannah would have found in such novels a partial mirror of her own experiences, especially experiences of the double standards and inequities arising from the gendered social and legal hierarchies of her day. And she would have found encouragement in pious and resilient heroines who weathered adversity while competently managing their own affairs. By 1759, Hannah was a widow. Her late husband, colony bigwig Gowan Corbin, stipulated in his will that should Hannah ever remarry, her inheritance of half of Corbin's estate would be reduced by 1/6 to the standard widow's third. The widow's third entitled a widow to the use of 1/3 of the husband's estate for her lifetime or until she remarried. In consequence of this, and until her death, Hannah signed her name
Hannah Corbin, widow.
Hannah Corbin, widow, enjoyed the legal status of a femme sole, a woman alone, and could thus negotiate legal contracts in her own name, own property, including enslaved African Americans, and dispose of her own property in her own name. Hannah Corbin, widow, unlike the married Mrs. Corbin, belonged to a small minority of adult women, especially widows, who defied the good wife norm, enjoying some of the same privileges free white men enjoyed, and making up a significant economic force in Virginia. So after more than a decade of co-managing Peckatone plantation with her late husband, Hannah Corbin, widow, hung on to a full half share of the late Corbin's legacy. This, in spite of the fact that soon on the heels of Corbin's death, Hannah openly took a live-in lover named Dr. Richard Lingan Hall, who attended Gowan Corbin in his final days. An unpaid medical bill of £68 was among the debts of the late Corbin, and we can only guess at what feelings may have been born around Corbin's deathbed. Ultimately, Hannah Corbin, widow, kept both her rightful half of Corbin's estate and Dr. Hall, her husband in all but name until his death in 1774. Hall's last will and testament kept up the pretense, noting that his children Elisha and Martha were
born of Mrs. Corbin.
The near silence about the relationship of Hannah and Dr. Hall in Lee family correspondence suggests that it was initially a point of friction that later resolved into a subject of studied avoidance. The only reference to Hannah's irregular arrangement occurs in a somewhat overwrought letter from her youngest brother Arthur Lee, who was then studying medicine in Edinburgh, to Richard Henry Lee, back home at Stratford.
How and where is our unchaste sister? Is she irrecoverably lost? Angels would weep at it. Oh, try, my brother. Try, I beseech you, to recall her. Oh, then attempt. Pursue. Try every gentle winning art to lure her to herself. Sooner in me might every faculty be changed than I could cease to love her. Even now, compassion steals upon me and melts me into tears for her perversion.
Richard Henry undoubtedly knew that beseeching Hannah would get him nowhere. As the brother to whom she was closest, Richard Henry knew Hannah to be independent-minded and headstrong. And this wasn't the only time Hannah set her foot on a path other than the one prescribed for her. The Stratford Lees were staunch Anglicans, but in 1764 Hannah was cited for failing to attend worship, and sometime after 1772, in the long shadow of the First Great Awakening, she converted to the Baptist religion, which emphasized inclusive participation and the intensity of religious feelings over the formal and solemn Anglicanism of her youth. A Baptist marriage would have legitimized her life with Dr. Hall in the way that mattered most to pious Hannah, and would conveniently have had no legal standing, meaning that Hannah Corbin widow would have been a widow still in the eyes of Anglican Virginia. But despite speculation, no records confirm that such a marriage took place. Her conversion to the Baptist faith, with its emphasis on sentiment and feeling and sincerity, fit with her literary preferences. And perhaps the perseverance of Virginia Baptists in the face of tough legal restrictions on the practice of their religion also resonated with her experience as a woman facing challenging cultural and legal constraints. On March 14, 1778, Hannah writes to her sister Alice, who was then staying at Chantilly with their brother Richard Henry Lee.
I have wrote to my brother, and I beg you will use your interest with him to do something for the poor desolate widows.
Hannah's letter to Richard Henry has not survived, but his reply has, and it is among the most scrutinized letters from the revolutionary generation of Lees.
Chantilly, March 17th, 1778. My dear sister, distressed as my mind is, and has been, by a vast variety of attentions, I am merely able by letter to give you the satisfaction I could wish on the several subjects of your letter. Reasonable as you are, and friendly to the freedom and happiness of your country, I should have no doubt about giving you perfect comfort in a few hours' conversation. You complain that widows are not represented, and that, being temporary possessors of their estates, ought not to be liable to the tax. The doctrine of representation is a large subject, and it is certain that it ought to be extended far as wisdom and policy can allow. Nor do I see that either of these forbid widows having property from voting, notwithstanding. It has never been the practice either here or in England. Perhaps it was thought rather out of character for women to press into those tumultuous assemblies of men where the business of choosing representatives is conducted, and it might also have been considered as not so necessary, seeing that the representatives themselves, as well as their immediate constituents, must suffer the tax imposed in exact proportion as does all other property taxed, and that therefore it could not be supposed the taxes would be laid where the public good didn't absolutely demand it. This, then, is the widow's security as well as the never-married women who have lands in their own right, for both of whom I have the greatest respect and would at any time give my consent to establish their right of voting, although I am persuaded that it would not give them greater security, nor alter the mode of taxation you complain of.
For all that we're lucky to have this letter, we must keep in mind that Hannah isn't here the subject of her own thoughts, which have been processed and restated by her brother, however able he was. The estates left to Hannah made her a person of significant property and a taxpayer. From her letter to Alice and Richard Henry's reply, we gather that Hannah wished to apply the revolutionary principle of no taxation without representation to propertied widows. Hannah's concern for desolate widows may refer to the grim facts of the ongoing war with England. But the question stands, were her patriot brothers guilty of hypocrisy on this point of principle? Richard Henry answers that the principle of no taxation without representation doesn't apply here. When Parliament levied on the colonies a tax that no member of Parliament paid, the tax was untethered from the economic realities of living in the colonies. There just wasn't sufficient common interest between the taxers and the taxed. The Virginia assemblymen who levied taxes on Virginians had to pay the taxes they levied, and Richard Henry suggests that for reasons of economic self-interest, they levied taxes only when necessary for the public good. His point is just that as a self-interested tax-paying Virginian, Hannah is represented by another self-interested tax-paying Virginian. If Hannah had been shaped by the novels she read, she was unlikely to find convincing the claim that her interests were being considered by the men in the Virginia Assembly. Was Hannah looking more for advocacy than mere representation? And how are we to overcome the problems posed by a single person representing so many diverse and different people and interests? Is legitimate representation a function of how similar the representative is to me or you?
The doctrine of representation is a large subject, and it is certain that it ought to be extended far as wisdom and policy can allow.
In this private correspondence, Richard Henry offers privately his support for the right of propertied women to vote, widows, and the unmarried, and in so doing seems to extend the policy beyond his sister's immediate concern, widows. This is an open-minded opinion for the 1770s, however flawed by silences on the question of women without property, as well as enslaved, indentured, and indigenous women. If political representation is the activity of making citizens' voices and views present in public policy-making processes, Hannah wanted propertied widows at least to have their say in choosing the political actors responsible for taking their voices and views into account. Later in the letter, Richard Henry claims that a Virginia law passed in October 1777 gave freeholders and heads of households, including women, the right to vote for county tax commissioners. There is no extant evidence to suggest that Hannah or any other woman in Virginia voted for county tax commissioners before the position was changed from elected to appointed in 1781. As considerable as voting rights were in revolutionary and early national America by 18th century standards, voting largely remained the prerogative of propertied white men, and the new Constitution proved to be a disappointment on the subject of broadening the electorate and voter requirements. As a result, suffrage or political franchise became a focal point for the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement, and it remains a contested ground today. But that is a story for another day. To read this month's letter in full, log on to the Lee Family Digital Archive at leefamilyarchive.org and search Hannah Lee Corbin. From Stratford Hall Historic Preserve in Westmoreland County, Virginia, I'm Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi.
Dear listeners, wouldn't you like to do more than just listen? Become an active participant with Stratford Hall in the production of new and exciting programmes like Stratford Mail. Sponsor an episode or more of Stratford Mail by getting in touch with us at www.stratfordhall.org/support-Stratford, and please don't forget to follow Stratford Mail and share it with someone you love, someone you know. They'll be so happy you did.